This week's episode is brought to you by Foundation Devices, the makers of the beautiful air-gapped, open source, assembled in the USA Bitcoin hardware wallet called Passport. And by air-gapped, I mean this device never goes online, never needs to connect to your computer. Every time you connect your hardware wallet to your internet-connected computer, you're running some risk. But Passport uses an SD card to eliminate that risk. And it's super simple to sign Bitcoin transactions by just scanning QR codes. It's so much safer to do it this way. You can use their mobile app called Envoy, or you could use Sparrow Wallet or Electrum. There's 100 ways that you can use Passport. You can do it in your own way. The attention to detail and design is just amazing. So many crypto hardware wallets look like they were made by engineers, right? But the Passport is totally different. It's beautiful. The average person would look at this and think it's a little mobile phone or something like that. It has a rechargeable battery, a glass display, really, really nice. You need to take a look at Passport, decide for yourself. They're back in stock, so go to foundationdevices.com and check it out. This week's guest is the inimitable Frances Coppola. She's an outspoken writer and speaker on banking, finance, and economics. She's a well-known critic of cryptocurrency, the author of a book called The Case for People's Quantitative Easing, and recently she had a pretty high-profile run-in with British politician Nigel Farage when he claimed his bank account got closed for political reasons. We'll get into that a little bit in this conversation. Let's get right to it with Frances Coppola. Okay, Frances, thanks for joining me today. I'm actually a big fan of yours, even though I disagree with I'd say like 98%, I would say.
That's okay. There's 2%. We can work with that.
Right. I think I first came across you because of your outspoken views on Bitcoin.
Yep.
And then I explored deeper, some of the things you were talking about with regard to banking, and you spent time working in the banking industry, right?
Yeah, quite a few years.
And so I got deeper and realized you have a deeper philosophy here, than any one topic. So that's why I wanted to talk to you. I wanted to find out more about how you think and how it relates to some of the topics that are going on today, like things that concern me, like CBDC technology and things like that, that ultimately, my major concern with stuff like that is government micromanaging my life in the long term, and so, but I wanted to get first a sense of what you think, how do you define money? What is money to you?
Fundamentally, to me, money is a medium of exchange. It's how we transact. It's how we trade with each other. And money is the means of trading with people we don't know, people we don't trust. That is the purpose of money. We're doing transactions with people we know and trust. We don't use money. If with family members, for example, we don't necessarily use money. We use money when we're dealing with people who are more distant from us, who maybe we don't entirely know, or who maybe, and the other reason we use money is to do with what they call the double coincidence of wants, which means that, say, if the problem with barter, everybody thinks it all come from barter. So if I've got like 2 kilos of potatoes and you've got a kilo of carrots or something, we can do a trade. Except that we've kind of got an implication that assumes that at the same time I need carrots and you need potatoes. But if we don't, if I say need carrots in a couple of weeks' time, but you need potatoes now, then if you see what I mean, then we've got we've got a timing problem. And money solves the timing problem. It's like we can correctly use the term token about money. But money is a token. It's a representation,
right,
of value. It's a value that can be cashed in at a future date for something real.
Okay, I think we're on the same page there. Money represents to me almost, it's like human energy in a way, because it represents I have something that I obtained either through my work or by trading something else that I had to obtain it. And you're interested in that thing, and I can trade it to you for something else. But then you take money as a concept, and it can substitute for any of those things. And it becomes this thing that everybody wants because it stands for that human energy that's required to obtain things, including food and water and everything.
Or another way of looking at it is that it represents our obligations to each other.
Right. That's a good point too. Yeah. And so, but at its core, like, I think we agree that money is a concept, right? It's an idea, and that everybody needs to agree on that idea in order for it to be worth anything, right?
Oh, absolutely. And one of the features of money is not just that people need to agree on that they are all prepared to use these tokens as money, as a means of exchange, but they also need to agree on what they're worth. Money is as a means of accounting for things, for measuring value. So that's one of the functions of money is what we call a unit of account, whereby we agree that 2 kilos of potatoes are worth this much in monetary terms. And that enables us actually to deal with or resolve some of the issues that come out of where I've got 2 kilos of potatoes, but you've only got a kilo of carrots. What is the relative value of potatoes and carrots if we're doing a 1-for-1 exchange there? So carrots are worth twice as much as potatoes in monetary terms.
Right. So money has to be more to you, though, I think, based on some of the stuff that I've heard you talk about. I think that it's one thing to say money is, this tool for exchanging value that you've earned. But it's another thing to say that money should be controlled by government, right? And used as a tool to incentivize certain things or to cause certain behaviors to happen. So doesn't that expand the definition a little bit beyond what you just said?
Well, I think it depends what you consider the role of a government to be. And we can get into at this stage the nature of government and what its role in society is. You can have private money. I mean, I don't myself. I mean, it's interesting. You seem to think I'm very much a kind of centrist government control type person, but I'm really not. And quite a lot of what I've written has actually been about private monies. And one of the things that happens when governments become too controlling around money is you start to get private monies developing. People start using other things as money. Money is not fundamentally in that respect, when you consider money as a means of exchange, as a representation of our obligations to each other, and a representation of value, it's not fundamentally a government construct. That's more social construct, if you see what I mean. You could have a community which doesn't have a government, but which does have some form of token that everybody agrees represents value for them and obligations for them. I mean, famous examples are things like Yapstones. But there's there is another way of looking at it, which is that I think money also conveys a sense of identity of who we are as a people, who we are as a nation, who we are as a community. And if you are part of a community that has a government, even if it, never mind what kind of government that is, it doesn't have to be a democratic one. Back in the olden days, it was often theocratic, so money was often issued by temples. But it kind of represented who we are, our identity as a nation, or as a community, or as a state, or whatever. And people become very, very attached to it. Which is why, for example, in my own country, we really, really like the pound, and we don't want to give it up.
So when you say it represents, the people in a way, or the identity of a nation, do you mean that money can be used to mold the identity of a nation through its supply, through restrictions on it, through creating new money. Is that what you're talking about, or am I missing that?
Partly. It's more, it's kind of related to also governments mandating what weights and measures will be used, that type of thing. So again, we've come back to my own country, the UK, great deal of debate following our departure from the EU about whether we stop using metric measures and go back to Britain's unique set of imperial measures that we used to use when I was a child, and that in some parts of our economy we still use. And there are people who really, really want that to happen, because for them it's an expression of our sovereignty as a nation. It's who we are. It means we are different from them. We use a different set of weights and measures. We use a different money. It's part of our identity.
I guess part of why I'm asking these questions is because I've heard you and seen you talk about the idea that new money should be created to solve social issues, right, and to solve wealth inequality and quantitative easing and all that kind of stuff, which indicates that, and that's what I was alluding to before too, is that type of policy. Those policies basically go beyond just, and they almost, to me, they nullify the idea of money as that symbol of your time and your energy, and they turn money into a tool for government to manipulate the behavior of people. Whether or not it's for good or for bad is a different story, but it is about how can we incentivize and manipulate people into doing what we want them to do because we think it's for the better, for the greater good. Like, to me, that changes the definition of money to a certain extent, almost mutates it.
It can do, and I don't rule that out. And when we talk about CBDCs, there are issues around that concern me greatly. But fundamentally, if you are seeing money as simply a means to an end, what is the means to an end that we want? We want people to be able to transact with each other. We want people to agree on what the value of things is. We want people to be able to build up wealth. Those are the three functions of money. And if you want that to happen, if you want people to be able to do that, then you have to have enough money. Now, your community may create enough tokens itself, just organically. But in countries and states that have governments, historically, money's always been created by government. And the question is then, how much of it should they create, and who should have it? And I'm actually not very into government necessarily being totally in control of either of those.
So how would you describe yourself politically?
Centre.
Okay.
I'm very pragmatic, but I'm kind of politically neutral, really. Right now in the UK, I'm probably a little bit lefty, but that's only because my government everybody here has lurched so far to the right, and in America, you're even further to the right. So I guess I'm probably a bit lefty, but I'm certainly not this kind of sort of and I think perhaps a more helpful way of looking at it, I've found more helpful, is how authoritarian are you? And I'm not very, although I believe in sort of things like equality and social justice and so forth, I'm not very authoritarian. I'm not very into government sort of state mandating things. So when it comes to money, for example, we've had at intervals since the 2008 financial crisis, we've had people proposing that banks should lose their money creating powers and all money should be created by governments. And I'm going, no. No, actually, what we have, believe it or not, is actually a decentralized system whereby money is created by commercial banks in response to demand for loans. And the interference, if you like, with that from government concerns the provision of the underlying means of settlement between banks, but it doesn't affect what banks do. But we do interfere with how banks do that, because banks can be really very criminal things, and that's all to do with the rule of law.
Right. Yeah, the whole left and the right thing in America is so hard now it's hard to put these things on a scale or on a spectrum, because the people who are most authoritarian when it comes to money and social issues are actually the people who believe that they're least authoritarian a lot of times. When we're talking about, can you force somebody to officiate your wedding if they don't want to? Like, if you say yes, that's authoritarian. You're telling somebody they have to do something they don't want to do. Can the government force somebody to undergo a medical procedure? If you say yes, then even if you think it's for the greater good, you're still authoritarian. But
Absolutely.
they would never think that.
No, and I'm actually very surprised how authoritarian some people who consider themselves to be libertarians are. And they don't seem aware of it. I mean, in my own country, for example, we are now with a really quite right-wing government, supposedly firmly wedded to free markets and freedom of speech and all of these things, centrally planning the labour market completely, and dictating to banks who they must do business with. How is that consistent with this kind of belief in free market and freedom of speech, freedom of expression, the freedom to do business with whom you please? It's completely inconsistent. I personally, from a philosophical point of view, more on the point of, there are limits, there must be limits, because otherwise we do get unacceptable practices like, discrimination on grounds of nothing but race or something like that. But within those limits, which are kind of mandated by human rights legislation, really, businesses, people, so should be free to transact with whoever they want to transact with. And if that means saying, I actually don't want to give you a bank account, then that's okay.
Yeah, so you had that memorable run-in with Nigel Farage on a news program. I don't know what it is because I'm American and don't watch British TV, but when it's you and it pops up on Twitter or YouTube, I'm going to watch it. And I watched that. And just to summarize, what I understood from it was his bank account was shut down. These memos came out that showed that people in the bank were concerned about his political views. But also he sold his house, or he closed the mortgage, and that disqualified him from continuing at the bank, right? It was something like that. And you were pointing out that that was the actual determining factor, not the political concerns, but the financial, just the black and white rules say he was disqualified from having that bank account.
Absolutely. The point I was making, which was totally supported by what was in the information he obtained from his bank, was that the decision had been made on the grounds that he no longer met their published financial criteria. Coutts is an elite brand. It offers banking services to very rich people, and you have to have really rather a lot of money, either that or borrow an awful lot. Or both, in order to qualify for an account with them. So when his account fell below those criteria, they decided to close it. Now, the question was more to do with, did they warn him they were going that paying off his mortgage would have that effect, and B, did they give him the opportunity to bring his account up to commercial viability? And the answer seems to be no. They simply decided that they didn't really want him as a customer anyway. And from the dossier, it appears that really because they reckoned he just posed this massive reputational risk to them, which in the event proved to be the case.
So, like, everything that I read, and I heard what you had to say about it, and I read about it and saw what you were posting on Twitter about it. And to you, it's a very black and white issue, with regard to why they closed it. But I mean, first of all, you can clearly see why he would make this argument, right? Like, you can understand that point of view at its core, right? Even if you don't agree with it.
I can understand the argument. I just think it's wrong. And I think it's based upon a misunderstanding of banks. I mean, if you actually sort of look at banks, I don't hold a torch for banks. I am not a shill for banks. I know what they're like. And banks fundamentally are motivated by money. They will take on the most awful people if they think they'll make money from them. But if they've got somebody who is not earning them very much money, and who is a reputational risk to them, which means that some of the things he do, because given he had actually disclosed to the press his banking relationship with Coutts. He'd done that in 2019, it's in the Times. So it was a matter of public knowledge that he banked with Coutts. And they were concerned that something he did might cause them reputational damage, by which they would mean drive away customers that they want, drive away shareholders, cause the bank's share price to crash, cause them to lose revenue in terms of income from lending, or income from deploying people's their high net worth customers' wealth in productive ways. So from their point of view, they would have been looking at it as the risk to their revenues that he presented. He wasn't earning them enough, and he was a risk, and he was creating a risk that they would drive other people away. And you have to look at it like that, because this is how banks work. Even the risk, when we're dealing with money laundering risks and things like that, in banks will launder money, and they do, if they think that the amount of money they'll make from money laundering is is enough to justify the risk of being heavily fined if they get caught. Right?
Yeah.
Okay, and all banks think like that. Fines are a cost of business.
Right.
The problem where they got caught out in the last 10 years or so was that the regulators ramped up the fines. So when BNP Paribas got hit with a 9 billion fine by the Fed, it sent shockwaves around the world, because suddenly all these banks, that was for sanctions busting, suddenly all these banks are going, oh my God, that's a much bigger fine than we're used to. Right? So
Right.
I immediately started thinking, actually, some of this dodgy stuff we've been involved in, we'd better get out of, because if they hit us with a fine like that, we're in trouble. It's no longer worth their while doing dodgy things. Right?
So
It's not, it's all to do with banks' core business, which is to make money.
so you're not saying that his political views, the fact that he's conservative and led the Brexit movement, etc., you're not saying that didn't play a role. You acknowledge that played a role in the situation. You're just saying that it wasn't about the actual political views. It was about the fact that they could cost the bank customers and hurt their reputation in the long term.
Exactly
So,
that. Yeah.
but I guess the next question would be, I hear what you're saying, and I agree with you. Like, capitalism, that's the rule. The rules are capitalism, right? And we're going to
banks are capitalist institutions.
right. So,
as you would expect capitalist institutions to behave.
but on a social level, on a societal level, do you think that there's a problem with that kind of precedent where a bank can, and I'm not saying that there should be laws against this or anything like that. I'm just thinking like on a sort of a philosophical level. And let's substitute, because in my head, okay, we can substitute Nigel Farage for anybody, on the left, right? It's like, or anybody who's a minority, or anybody, let's say all of a sudden transgender people become persona non grata for whatever reason. And if you are banking a transgender or leader, activist, right? Somebody who's out there, pushing for transgender rights, and a bank decides that having that, now the tides have turned and people don't like transgender people anymore, right? And it's like, okay, now we're going to this is a reputational negative for us to be banking this person. Do we start to get into dangerous territory where money starts to act as a censor in a way, and capitalism starts to act as a control mechanism for tyranny of the majority?
Yeah, we absolutely do. And that's why we need safeguards around this. So I'm not saying that banks should always be able to do exactly what they please. We have human rights legislation and we need it. So there are groups, certainly, in the UK, that have protected rights. That includes transgender people, and people can't have their bank accounts closed because they are trans, or because they're black, or because they're Jewish, or because they're women, or all of those have been
Only
done.
because they're conservative men.
No. They can't be. They can't have their bank accounts closed because of their political beliefs either, and it's. But it's this kind of nuanced thing about what is the effect on me of this particular person who has an extremely high profile, who shouts his views from the rooftops. Coutts said themselves in that bundle of documents that they had other customers with very similar views who were not posing the same risk because they were much quieter. It was the public nature of his views. It wasn't his views, it was how he manifested them. It was his behaviour. And that's actually quite a nuanced point legally about at what point does it become does it stop being about what you believe and become about how you behave? And are banks justified in closing accounts because of your behaviour? And in much the same way as a barman can chuck you out of the bar if you're drunk and disorderly and you start swearing at the other customers, right? They have the right to do that. Well, why wouldn't a bank have the right to close an account of somebody whose behaviour was alienating other customers and putting their revenues at risk?
Yeah, there's a direct connection between, in my head, and they're totally different issues, but the way I think about this stuff is the way that I think about how Twitter during the pandemic was censoring conservative voices, and obviously kicking Trump off of the platform and using the whole January 6th thing as the excuse for it. But in reality, as we all know, and as we've seen, in leaked documents and stuff, it was really about the same kind of thing, reputational risk to the platform. Like, what kind of liabilities does this create for the platform? Is it worth it? There's a reason that they kept a lot of left-wing voices that were just as violent, just as insightful as Trump was, but they got rid of Trump, and so it's kind of, there's this movement throughout the world to try to extinguish what's perceived as conservative voices. And conservative is a broad term, but it's more like non-traditional, I guess nationalist to a certain extent.
Well, I would say actually they are traditional, and that's the point. Actually, is that to the extent they're being extinguished is because people don't want those kind of very traditional views coming back.
Do you think they should be extinguished?
No, actually, I don't. I think within reason, all people should have the right. Everybody has the right to their beliefs, and within reason. And like I said, this is about behaviour.
What do you mean within reason, though?
No. I'll explain what I mean.
Okay.
I'll explain what I mean. That people have the right to express those beliefs as well, and the limit to that for me is actually when expressing those beliefs starts to trample on the rights of others. For example, if it's abusive, that's not okay. So and it's at what point is this just rather assertive expression of my legitimate beliefs? And at what point does it start becoming abusive to other people? And that I think is the distinction. I do think the zeitgeist is changing, actually, that we went through a period when it was conservative voices that were being cancelled. And I actually had an issue with that. I don't necessarily agree with those voices, but they have the right to hold and express their opinions as long as they do so politely. And I follow a number of right-wing accounts myself. I don't know if you're aware of that, but I do. And I talk to them if they're polite. If we can have it, we don't have to agree. It doesn't matter, as long as we can engage respectfully, respect each other's, respect the fact that we don't agree, and not resort to insulting each other and being rude. I think it's maybe this is very British of me, but I do actually think that maybe this is to do with the fact that we are a relatively small island and fairly crowded island nation. So if we don't get on with each other, then we tend to get sort of major brawls, which isn't good. So manners have always been quite a British thing, as interesting they are in Japan as well, which I think is for similar reasons. Um,
Right.
yeah, getting along with people and engaging in robust debate, yeah, but respectful debate, I think is really important. It's how we develop new ideas. It's how we move society on in good ways. Sometimes it can be in bad ways as well, but we need that. I wouldn't want to see that stifled. I just would like people to be more open to other people's ideas and other people's beliefs, more willing to listen, more willing to think, and less willing to resort to abuse and kind of echo chamber type pylons, where people just pile in, and the broken record effect, where they just keep it, where everybody piles in and says it's like this, and I keep saying, but that's not what the facts say. We do seem to have reached a point where if enough people say something, it must be true, even if it's not actually what the facts are, and that bothers me enormously.
You said before that you're skeptical about government having complete control over the money supply,
absolutely.
etc. But do you think that money should be used as a tool to keep that speech in check, and to prevent abuse and to prevent those human rights violations through speech specifically that you're
No,
talking about?
no, I don't think that's an appropriate use of money, actually. Um, as I've said, that money is a tool of the law. So if you have a bank that is facilitating money laundering, for example, and it gets caught, then it will be fined. And so it will suffer a monetary penalty, and that will hurt its shareholders, who ultimately it is responsible to. And so that is a way of imposing a sanction on a bank that breaks the law. But within the law, no, I don't think money should be used to control speech. And in fact, it worries me hugely that actually some very rich people are trying to do exactly that, use their money, their wealth, to silence people who disagree with them and are much poorer than them. I'm seeing the courts used in that way. The defamation suits used to silence people who are poorer
Mm-hmm.
and who are dissenting voices, and that's not right. And I don't think the government should do that either, by the way, but I see it as more of a problem of very rich people who may be in government or may not be in government, basically abusing the law because they have monetary power, and that's not right. No, justice should be available to everybody.
Is the situation in Britain similar to the U.S. with regard to banking? The U.S. banks are heavily controlled. They're heavily regulated, obviously, and they're practically, at this point, I like to consider them as branches of government, as agents of the government, basically, because they're enforcing the monetary rules of the government. They're completely controlled as far as what they can do, how they can act. And they have to comply with regulations with KYC, AML, bank secrecy laws. They have to reveal information to the government about their customers. Are Britain's banks in the same boat as far as that goes?
Yes. Yeah, and actually banks are worldwide. There's very few places that are not operating that kind of control of banks. Really because, and it's fair to say that certainly the KYC AML industry has grown up in the last decade or so. Really because otherwise we have got a problem as societies with criminal activity and kind of law breaking, really. And so all jurisdictions control their banks because if they don't, banks can be used to facilitate law breaking. So do you, all businesses to some degree are controlled by the law, and all businesses, therefore, and all businesses can suffer monetary penalties if they break the law. So in that respect, that also is using money to control what businesses do. It's not necessarily just banks. Banks are heavily controlled for sure. One of the issues I think with banks, though, and the reason why I'm a bit concerned about the creeping the kind of sort of philosophical attitude to banks, and it bothers me. And I'm seeing this actually quite a lot in the crypto world of all places, or the banks that are associated with the crypto world, with this idea that banks are agents of the state. I mean, they are in the sense that they create that they create money. They are licensed to do so by the state to create money through lending and to accept deposits. And when a bank accepts a deposit, it's actually converting it into its own money. So they are licensed, which is because of their license deemed to be equivalent to the money created by the state, right? And they are licensed to do that. So in that sense, they are an arm of the state. But I'm increasingly seeing the argument that banks individually, and this is an important point, are de facto public utilities because of their role in the payment system. And I fundamentally disagree with that individual banks or anything of the kind. The banking system collectively in Western countries, because of its domination in the payment system, because of the way in which electronic payments and bank accounts have become so important to us, is essentially to all intents and purposes a public utility, but you should be aware public utility doesn't necessarily mean state controlled, but individual banks are not. So when we're talking about people who have had their bank accounts closed because the bank decides it doesn't want to deal with them, as long as they have banking services available to them from other banks, the banking system collectively is meeting its obligation towards them as a public utility. Where we need to have a backstop, potentially, if we are to regard the banking system as a public utility, is what do we do if we have people or companies that no bank will service? What is the state's obligation to those people and individuals, and does it have a responsibility to step in to make sure those people are served? In the UK, the big banks, the high street banks, because they are not just licensed by the state but explicitly in effect guaranteed by it, because they're too big to fail, they have a statutory duty, a legal duty, to provide basic banking services to anybody, though there are certain exclusions from those, and the exclusions are people who can't prove their identity, people whose immigration status is dodgy, and people who've committed financial crimes. But everybody else, they are obliged to give basic banking services to, and that actually is why NatWest offered Nigel Farage a bank account right? Because Nigel Farage said that he had gone to 9 other banks and they had all turned him down for accounts.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't give reasons why, and they're not obliged to, because if customers or would-be customers fail anti-money laundering checks or something like that, the bank's not allowed to tell them, because it constitutes tipping off. So the bank's not obliged to give a reason, and we don't know whether any of these banks did give reasons for turning him down, because he hasn't disclosed that, which is fine. That's his prerogative to keep that to himself. But NatWest then offered him a personal bank account, because as NatWest and Coutts, you're probably aware of this, NatWest and Coutts are all part of the NatWest Group, which is nearly 40% owned by the UK government. And so NatWest PLC, the UK bank, NatWest Group, had an obligation to ensure that closing Nigel Farage's Coutts accounts didn't mean he became unbanked. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah. I mean, that's all. He had options, is what you're getting to. He had an option.
And what I'm saying is that that they gave him an option when it became apparent that other banks weren't going to give him options, and there was a risk that he would simply end up without a bank, without banking at all. And that's what I mean by safeguards. And we do need to make sure we have safeguards in the system, because banking has become so essential. We do need to make sure there are safeguards in the system so that legal businesses aren't engaging in illicit activity or something, and individuals subject to the things I mentioned potentially, although even there, some of those are a little bit dodgy, do actually get the banking services that they need.
I
And
just
this actually
Mhm.
kind of touches on a few things that have been going on in stablecoin world, to do with Custodia Bank, and there's one that came out today on Pay Services Limited, who are claiming the Federal Reserve is obliged to give them Fed master accounts, and it kind of touches on that as a bank, it's very difficult to operate if you don't have a Fed master account, and so it can cripple your business. And therefore, arguably, the Fed has a statutory duty to provide master accounts to banks and payment institutions.
the
Um,
Fed is a kingmaker. They decide who's going to be in business and who's not as a
well,
bank.
no, that's exactly what the lawsuit's about. Is saying actually the Fed doesn't have that right. That
But they
it is
do. I mean, they do it. They turn
they
down
do
like
it. They do it, and it's being challenged in court.
I just want to challenge some of what you said before. It kind of ties into this about
Mm,
banks being private businesses and
yep.
not being agents of government when they are just, first of all, when historically for decades, if not over a century, banks have been created to a certain extent by the Federal Reserve, and given authorization to operate by the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve, is like they turned down a bank called Anchorage, I think it was called, a few months ago, which, tried to create a bank. I believe it was in Wyoming that would sort of opt out of fractional reserve, to a certain extent and be
No, but
fully backed.
that's exactly what I'm talking about. That's the
Okay.
case I'm talking about, right?
Okay.
Let me talk it through, because in America it's different from the UK, right? In America, you have state chartered banks, right? So Custodia Bank, Pay Services Limited, and so on are are licensed banks, but their licenses are issued by the states. That was also true of the banks that failed. So
Mhm.
Silicon Valley Bank was a California chartered bank. Signature Bank New York was a New York chartered bank, right? Their licenses are issued by the states. Um, some of them are also federally supervised, federally regulated banks, the bigger ones are. But when you're dealing with these state chartered banks, the problem you've got is that the state chartered, they are banks by virtue of having their state charter, their state license. And the argument is that if they are licensed banks, but not members of the Federal Reserve System, the Federal Reserve doesn't have the right to turn them down for a master account. That's essentially the argument that Custodia is making and Pay Service is making. Um, and the argument that they present some kind of risk because they've got a non-traditional banking model, they're doing full reserve banking or whatever they're doing, doesn't wash,
Right.
because the Fed has an obligation. And I was looking at this earlier, and there is a contested case with the split three-way decision. The courts really don't seem to know what to do about this yet. They're basically saying, it's a very fast-moving situation. Facts are developing, so they can't give a full statutory interpretation at the moment. But there is a contested case involving a credit union, which was turned down for a Fed master account on the grounds that under its state laws, it could deal with businesses dealing with marijuana. But under federal law, it couldn't. And it was turned down because because it couldn't guarantee that it wouldn't deal with companies who were legally within its state dealing with marijuana, but illegally federally. And that's a peculiarity of the US legal system, that you can have this conflict between state and federal law. We don't really have that here.
Yeah.
Um,
It's a feature, by the way, not a
it's
bug.
Oh, for sure, it's a
The
feature.
friction.
Actually, your states have a considerable degree of independence,
Yeah.
and and in a way, it's a check on federal power that states have that. But it does create for some very complicated lawsuits.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me just take this out of the weeds just a little bit and reframe it, because the way that I like to approach this kind of stuff, specifically like with this Anchorage Custodia thing, where they want to create a bank that's fully backed, does not have this situation that every other bank in America has, where they don't have the cash, they can't honor every deposit. They want to create this bank that offers people full security, full, peace of mind that the money is there. If you deposit money, it's there. And they want to do that because there's demand for it. Obviously, people want that. So there's two ways to look at it, though. One is from the government's point of view. From the government's point of view, and when I say government, I include Federal Reserve because it's all connected, and to say absolutely. It's not is nonsense.
No, so that's absolutely correct.
Like the money creation policy, interest rates, it's all coming from the government. So from their point of view, it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit. It breaks the puzzle. It exposes the system to a certain extent, right? Because having even one bank connected into this system that's fully backed breaks the system.
I don't think it does.
No?
I don't think it does. I'm going to disagree with you there because we need diversity in our banking system. It's perfectly okay to have full reserve banks. It does not mean that all other forms of banks will die. Historically, full reserve banks actually don't tend to last very long, and the reason for that is that they're fundamentally unprofitable unless they start doing things that they really shouldn't be doing, and then they get stamped on. So I'd be interested to see if this time is different. But there is no reason why you can't have a banking system that has fractional reserve banks in it and full reserve banks in it. Let me give you an example. Back in the history of the UK, in Scotland, we had things called trustee savings banks. They were set up, they were non-profit institutions actually, that were set up to enable the poor to save, and they were mandated by law to back all of the deposits solely with government debt and gold. Right? They were full reserve banks. Bank reserves a long time ago, bank reserves kind of were gold then, so this is full reserve, right? They coexisted with fractional reserve banks. The problem you have when you have full reserve banks coexisting with fractional reserve banks, and particularly full reserve banks that don't pay interest on deposits. Now, these ones actually did, because these were savings banks. They did pay interest on deposits. But the ones that these new types that are popping up don't pay interest on deposits. And actually we saw with the banks that fell, Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank New York, Silvergate Bank, all of them were actually operating a similar model within a fractional reserve bank. It was like a part of their business that was full reserve, or supposed to be. The problem you've got is that that's all fine when interest rates are low, because there's not a great deal of incentive for people to move their savings out of a savings bank, a full reserve savings bank, into a fractional reserve bank that is doing lending and therefore can offer them higher rates. But as interest rates start to rise, that changes. And the trustee savings, the savings banks in the UK died in the 1970s when interest rates rose.
Okay, so why wouldn't that happen? I mean, what I was saying before when I said it would break the system, I meant like not that they would just defeat fractional reserve banks, but that the full reserve banks just don't fit into the puzzle that the government is trying, the policy they're trying to implement in America.
But my point is that actually that doesn't matter, because it's I can't answer for what the Fed is doing. I might disagree with what the Fed is doing. I might say this is ridiculous. Just give them a Moscow and let them have a go at doing this, and we'll see whether they survive. Right? Mm-hmm. That's my general philosophy: is let them, unless they're doing something that is actually illegal, or they're facilitating something that is actually illegal, like money laundering, or marijuana, breaking federal drug laws.
Well, right, of course.
Yeah, then let them do it. I don't actually have a problem with that at all.
But if they don't, it's almost what you're saying is there's no technical or fundamental reason that they can't have this exist within the U.S. monetary system, so it must be political.
As I understand it, having looked at the Federal Reserve's criticisms of both Custodia and Pay Services Limited, what the Federal Reserve seems to be saying with both of them is that it's not satisfied that their risk management frameworks are robust enough, and that is a legitimate criticism which needs to be heard. And I'm not sure that taking this kind of rather antagonistic attitude, saying you are obliged to give us an account, we shouldn't have to go through all this stuff, is entirely reasonable. I'd prefer to see them actually taking on board the criticisms and saying, well, okay, let's work with you to see what we need to do to make you feel happy about this. I feel we may have gone to legal action too soon and not pursued the negotiation. But then on the other hand, Custodia said and Pay Services both said they issued their request for Mastercard kind of like over a year before, and which is why the Custodia took them to court to try and force them to give an answer. So the Fed did sit on its hands a lot about that, and I don't think that's very good either. I'm certainly not saying the Fed's behaviour in this has been right at all, but as a principle, I would say, yes, if people want to create a full reserve bank that doesn't pay interest on deposits, that provides fast, efficient payment services, that backs all of its assets with central bank reserves and short-dated treasury bills or equivalents, right? Because you don't want duration risk creeping in, as we had with Silicon Valley Bank, right? Mm-hmm. Then I have no problem with that. My own personal view is that these things are fundamentally unprofitable in a high interest rate environment, and they will lose depositors in a high interest rate. If they only really work at scale, because if your reserves are all entirely central bank reserves and short and T-bills, then the amount of interest you will earn on those is determined entirely by the central bank. You do realise that, right? And secondly, and the central bank can simply say, I don't want to pay you, and reduce the payment on interest rate on reserves down to zero. And then what do you do? Anyway, it's kind of hoovering up pennies. The spread between your deposit rate, you're really your assets, the asset side of your balance sheet is the lowest earning assets. Do you see what I mean? Your net interest margin is not going to be very good. You're going to offer zero interest rate to depositors, and depositors might say, actually, there's a bank over there that's offering me some positive interest on demand deposits. Why wouldn't I go there? And that's actually what happened to the trustee savings banks, was that people went to the fractional reserve banks because the fractional reserve banks could give them higher interest rates.
Right. Now, whether or not it'll work is one thing, but the demand is coming, in this case, from Bitcoin type people, right? So the whole connection here with this bank and the idea and the concept behind it is coming from people who are working with and are interested in Bitcoin.
Absolutely. So, and my view is that if there's a need for this type of bank to service that type of customer, then the system should accommodate it. I honestly don't see that we need to be this antagonistic.
Okay, so the idea here, obviously was, let's take some control out of the government's hands to a certain extent. Let's have a fully backed bank. Let's have some peace of mind. And that's coming from the mentality that Bitcoin tends to offer people, which is, this sound money idea, this hard money, this out of the hands of the government money that exists. It's not fiat, it's completely separate and programmatic. Now, how would you summarize your view on Bitcoin these days?
Well, I think it's where it always was, really, which is it's quite sad, really. I mean, when I first encountered Bitcoin, back when the animals could talk, only about a year or so after it first emerged, when it was only worth pennies, it was widely believed then that it was going to be a faster, cheaper, more secure way of doing payments, particularly international payments. And then we had the scaling problems and the block size wars and all the rest of it, and it morphed into this store of value, and the valuation hit skies. And I think where we've ended up now is that seems to be regarded as some kind of risk asset, which I think is a little unfair. My view on Bitcoin is we do need monies like this. We do, because no government should ever have complete control of money. So we do need private monies, and Bitcoin is a good money for people who are in repressive regimes that
There's
want
the
to
quote. Bitcoin is a good money. I've got it. I've got the sound bite. I'm going to be using that on Twitter later.
Under some circumstances,
Selective editing.
It's a very niche use. Okay, it has certain good uses, and I've said this before. This is nothing new about this, Chris. I've said this before, that actually, and it's shown by the evidence that people who are in regimes where the government is playing a fast and loose with the value of money, so hyperinflation, very high inflation, Bitcoin is a place you can escape, is a money you can escape to.
So what's wrong with it?
And in regimes where the government is denying some people the means to transact, deciding who can and who can't get access to the payment system, for example. Again, Bitcoin is an alternative. I've never ever disputed that. Financial inclusion in some countries, Bitcoin is a good choice, but it's a niche use. It's never. I don't think it's ever going to be the worldwide mainstream money that I think many Bitcoiners wanted it to be. The Bitcoin standard that people went on about, I don't think is ever going to happen.
So just as a tool for holding value, as a tool for separating some part of your life from the control of a fiat money supply, you believe it has use in those cases?
It has, in some cases, has use. I mean, you have to look at the alternatives. What alternatives are there that people can use under those circumstances? And the biggest alternative in places like Venezuela is the US dollar. So it might well be they simply use Bitcoin as a bridge to dollars, because what they really want is dollars.
Right.
But even that's a legitimate use.
Right. Do you think that, like, how much because I know in the past, I think we've even had exchanges about the technology that supports and makes Bitcoin work and the decentralization of it. Do you see value in the idea that this type of technology is actually decentralized? Do you believe it's decentralized? Like, do you believe that it's sustainable in that way?
Okay, I think the problem, it was kind of an unforeseen effect in Satoshi's original design, because he didn't envisage the creation of mining pools. Now, I know they're kind of cooperatives, but when you have cooperatives like that, groups of people banding together, then your decentralization is effectively reduced, because they're banding together and operating together as one, by virtue of being in the pool. You can see what I mean. So your entities are, you've got a much smaller number of actual individual entities. It's not as atomized as it ought to be. And that is a concern. That said, Bitcoin is probably more decentralized than a good many other things, where decentralization is in name only, what somebody called it. And I think that Bitcoin is more decentralized than many other things, but I do think it is not as decentralized as Satoshi envisaged, and that we all hoped it would be.
Do you think it's the most decentralized form of money in the world, though?
No, frankly, I don't.
What is?
This is going to blow your mind, but taking across the globe as a whole, remember, I'm not talking about individual countries here, I'm talking about the world as a whole, the most decentralized form of money is actually the banking system.
Come on.
No, I'm
serious. You can't do this in the last few minutes of the podcast.
Yes, I really can. It's a decentralized form of money.
The banking system. But is the banking system a form of money?
No, but banks create money.
Right.
See, this is, I think, I when I'm discussing with crypto people, they can't get their heads around it, saying Bitcoin is not equivalent to say Visa or MasterCard or JP Morgan. It's not. It's more like the Federal Reserve, because it's creating base money. What banks create is a layer 2 above that. And they do so in a way that responds to demand. They're not doing it because governments are telling them to produce this much money. Governments kind of influence it with central banks influence it with interest rate policy, but central banks aren't telling them how much to create.
No, but central banks are controlled by a few people in each country or whatever that meet up every year and decide on what they're going to do.
Yeah, for sure. But they're not controlling what the banks do. In fact, one of the hilarious things about central banks is how difficult it is for them to control what banks do.
Right, but to say the banking system is decentralized is kind of
I'm talking about banks, not about central banks.
Okay, but even with banks, if you can get one conference a year where you get all these bankers together, I mean, the difference between...
So you have multiple conferences in the year when you get all these crypto people together. They're going to be decentralized. Oh, come on.
Let's compare it back to Bitcoin, though. I mean, can you... Bitcoin has nobody who you can go and meet with and change the supply, right? Well, they have nobody...
Go and talk to Blockstream.
You think that Blockstream can change the Bitcoin money supply?
No, actually, I don't, because it's programmed in. But
I'll tell you, Bitcoin's
as I just said to you, Bitcoin is not equivalent to a commercial bank. It's equivalent to something like the Federal Reserve. So you're not comparing like with like here.
But I asked you, what's more decentralized form of money than Bitcoin? And you went to the banking system.
I was taking it as the crypto world as a whole. The banking system is more decentralized than crypto.
Gotcha.
Taken as a whole.
And I guess what I was trying to get to was I can't fathom it.
I won't compare banks with Bitcoin because they're not equivalent.
Okay.
I'll compare banks with the crypto ecosystem as a whole. The two taken together globally. I would say, as it stands at the moment, that banks are actually more decentralized than crypto.
Do you think that this CBDC thing is a real thing, or do you think it's like decades away still?
No, they're going to do it. They're going to do it, and they'll do it quite soon, and then it will all shrivel and die because it's a bit of a joke, really. Anyway, I keep coming back to the same thing, which is actually if people understood a little bit more about central banks and the kinds of money they create and what's actually going on, then they would see this as the nothing burger it actually is. If you look at the kinds of money that central banks create as opposed to commercial banks, we'll distinguish between those two, what we call base money. It consists of physical cash, notes and coins, and bank reserves. Now, bank reserves are deposits at the central bank. They're the money that banks use to settle transfers between themselves, right? Of those two, bank reserves are much, much more than physical notes and coins. You and I never touch them. But they are electronic. They are digital money. Okay, so they're not on a blockchain. Does that matter? When you're talking about a CBDC, central bank digital currency, it doesn't have to be a blockchain-based money, does it? So what is the difference between a CBDC and bank reserves? The difference is who can get at it. So at the moment, you could say the banks have a CBDC already. They've had it for 50 years, actually, because goes back to the 1980s, electronic reserves. 1970s, 1980s, around about then. Right? That's been in existence for a very long time. What the CBDC debate is about, is whether central banks should extend access to central bank digital money to businesses and individuals. And if so, in what way? Should they do it by allowing businesses and individuals to have accounts at the central bank as banks do? Or should they do it by issuing a bearer instrument equivalent to physical cash? So an electronic version of physical cash. That's the debate that we're having. I personally would prefer the equivalent of physical cash version, um, but it seems to be foundering on a lot of political issues, which annoy me a lot, because if people are to have access to the digital economy, they need digital money. So central banks historically have produced physical cash, which is anonymous. It's difficult to trace it. It's government money that government really can't control. We need something equivalent. We need something equivalent, arguably. If you're going to go down the CBDC route, then what you should be doing is something equivalent. Digital money that is anonymous and can't be traced. It could be produced by government, but it's founding on political issues, and that's really where the need for private monies come in. Because if government can't do that, you can't have an anonymous digital form of money.
Well, you can.
Because governments are trying to control it, because governments are terrified that it'll facilitate money laundering or something.
Right.
You need private monies to plug the gap. And
because
seems to me is where crypto comes in.
Because we live in a world where everybody has to be treated like a criminal just in case you are a criminal. Right? Isn't that what it boils down to with money?
It is what it boils down to, but we also have to accept the fact that actually a proportion of society are criminals, and the rest of society need to be protected from them.
I think that the CBDC...
Isn't that called the rule of law?
No, I don't agree with I don't agree with anything that starts with, there may be some criminals, so everybody should be treated like a criminal. I mean, this all, this is what we go through at the airport, this is what we go through at the bank. I just saw a story yesterday that in order to turn on a new vaping device that's coming out, where you can vape nicotine or whatever, you're going to have to connect it to your phone through Bluetooth and scan your driver's license.
Yeah, I mean, that's annoying.
For me to, when I go to, I'm in Tennessee.
But then you need to argue about your federal laws.
Well, I mean, it's federal and state. I mean, it's if I go to buy a beer here in Tennessee, I'm an old, I'm in my late 40s. I have gray in my beard, but I have to show my driver's license. I always say to the cashier who's like 18, I'm like,
you need to, cracky, you lot are control freaks, aren't you? Here in the UK, if I go down to my supermarket and I buy a bottle of wine, right, and I take it to the self-service till, and I scan it, and a little light will go up, and a attendant will come over, and she will get will sign in with her account, and there will be a button on there that says the customer is obviously over 21.
Well, they can't do that here anymore because
she would just press that, and I don't have to show anything. She would just do it on the basis of what I look like.
But some people may get offended. You see, so we now have to check 80-year-olds' driver's licenses.
No, but we don't. You see, you not need to. You see, we're much more libertarian than you are, it seems, because we don't do that. People in the UK really don't have that kind of. No, it's not. It's not.
Yes, it is.
Honestly, we don't even have identity cards.
You get all of our social problems just a couple of years later.
We just don't. Anyway, yes, I'm very aware that we have this kind of sort of creeping control, and I don't like it either. But that's not to say we shouldn't have any control. I think that's the difference. And one of the things that's bothered me hugely about crypto is how incredibly infested with criminal behavior it's become. And when I say criminal, behavior that hurts people, behavior that robs people, that takes away their money.
Are you talking about crypto or the US dollar?
I'm talking about crypto.
Oh, not the US dollar, not cash.
No, because I'm talking about crypto, which has become one of the most fraud-infested spaces on the planet.
Cash, right? You're talking about cash.
No, I'm talking about crypto.
Oh, because I thought you were talking about cash.
No, I'm talking about crypto.
Because cash is used in way more crimes around the world.
I know, but there's much more. But there's much more of it.
That's true.
Relative to the size of the industry as a whole, crypto is way, way, way more criminal.
And what is this? What is this backed up by?
Just the stuff I've been, just what I've been looking at.
Yeah, I don't think it's true.
I've been in this space a long time, Chris, and honestly, and it wasn't like this to start with, but it has become so. And that, I think, is a lot of the problem. And you look at the kind of the frauds and scams and that have gone on all the time, constant rug pulls, people, hacks, exploits, even the MEV stuff that keeps popping up all over the place, that's fraud.
No, I can agree with you on that. There's a lot of systems that doesn't happen as much. That's more of an Ethereum and other blockchains.
No, I know you're talking about Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is relatively insulated from it, to be fair.
Fair
I was
enough.
talking about crypto as a whole, not about Bitcoin specifically. And you might want to say, well, you shouldn't tar Bitcoin with the same brush as that. And I say, yeah, I bet for an average person in the street looking in, it's all crypto. And what they see is the frauds and the scams and the rug pulls and the hacks and the exploits. And people don't see Bitcoin as fundamentally different from that. Bitcoin as a technology, I think, has proved itself robust to hacking and exploits and what have you, but I'm not talking about technology. I'm actually talking about how people use it. So even if your underpinning is something like Bitcoin, then it's a question of to what extent can it be used in a
I think
way.
what you're
No technology is ever watertight.
what you're actually talking about, though, is the government's ability to control it as a form of money. Yes, you are.
I'm not. I'm really not.
But that's what it boils down to. That's how you can screen out crimes and etc. Right?
So you're saying that we shouldn't have any screening out of crimes?
I'm saying that using the rules of the money supply, using legal tools to actually affect the way that money works in order to screen out crimes, what it does is it treats all the billions of people on this planet as criminals in order to catch the very, very few who actually are criminals.
So you don't think there should be any control?
I don't think that
any screening, any protection for people against fraudsters and scammers and hackers at all?
Those who would, there's an old quote, those who would give up liberty to get a little security or safety deserve neither liberty nor safety.
Right. Okay. So if you have a 50-year-old man who has put his life savings into some crypto and the crypto gets stolen, and
why did he put his money into crypto?
Because it was sold to him by charlatans and scammers.
Okay, so the crime is that he was lied to.
He was lied to, absolutely. So but you're saying there should be no control. How do you control people, stop people being lied to?
I'm not saying that you shouldn't control
people. Lying to people is rife. That's actually what went on with all the collapses last year, was people were lied to.
Okay, by the way, this is already a crime. Like, so if I go out there and I get somebody to give me $50 in Bitcoin and I lie to them in order to get it, I'm committing some sort of fraud. I'm committing the fraud, right? We don't need to have KYC AML involved in order to figure that out.
We do actually. Yes, we do, because if people are using a bank to commit a fraud and the bank doesn't know who they are, how are you going to detect that fraud?
In a perfect world,
if it's all anonymous, everybody can lie to everybody, and you'll never defraud everybody, and you'll never find out because it's all anonymous.
The way it used to be, right?
No, it was never like that. It was never like that. In the whole of my lifetime, people have always had to provide identity.
That's not true. That's not true. Not to the extent you have to today. You didn't even have to show an ID to get on a plane 20, 30 years ago.
Yes, you did.
Not to the extent it is now.
With respect, Chris, I was there 20, 30 years. I was getting on planes 20, 30 years ago, and you did have to show ID.
Yeah, but you can't dispute the fact that over time, especially since 9/11, it's been increasingly intrusive, like to the point where the example I just gave with the vape.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about that, because that did change everything. Right, okay. Shall I tell you where I was on 9/11?
Sure.
Well, you see, I live in Rochester in Kent, which is in the south of England. And on 9/11, I was in Scotland. at work. I was working for RBS at the time, and because I was commuting from London to Scotland, and I was leaving the office in the afternoon to go to the airport, to get on a plane, to fly home, to fly back south. Right? And
Mm-hmm.
as I was just about to leave the office, somebody said to me, have you heard the news? And I turned round, and the Twin Towers were on the Rochester screens. I still went to the airport and got on a plane. And it's very interesting to see how things have changed. These were internal flights within the UK, right? Okay, so there were no security checks. But you still had to show ID. We used to get on a plane with a driving license, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that flight that I got on then still had no security. It was completely normal because they hadn't put anything in place then. So I just walked onto the flight using a driving license, and I walked off at the other end with no security checks anywhere, got in my taxi and went home, right? Within a week or two later, that had all changed, and we'd got all the security things in place on these internal flights that we hadn't had before. And it was absolutely because of what happened on 9/11. We suddenly woke up to a threat that we didn't realise existed. Now, the response to that may have been disproportionate. Certainly some of the things that were put in place then.
Can I just back that up one sec? I don't mean to interrupt you.
Restrictions about what you can take on planes are gradually being restricted. And,
But you said...
being relaxed, perhaps they should be. We do tend to overreact to things, as humans do tend to overreact to things and get totally draconian about things that, with a bit more sense, you might not be. I mean, you could say we did that over COVID as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but you said that you woke up after 9/11 realizing that this threat existed that you didn't know existed before.
I say we as human beings, as
right.
People, we in the West.
Not
me personally.
I say we did know the threat existed before.
I don't think ordinary people did know.
People knew that a plane could get hijacked. People knew that planes could get bombed. People knew things could happen on planes.
No. Let me talk this through. It had not occurred to anybody.
That's not true. It had happened.
No. Hijacks, yes, but we had never, ever had planes hijacked and used as
the difference here was we'd never been terrorized to this extent. We'd never been this afraid. We'd never had the media show us these kinds of pictures and freak us out so bad.
I don't think that's true. It was it was the way it was done. It was the way it was done.
It was done in a way to capture the media.
It was done in a way, and it was done in a way that was unprecedented.
It certainly was unprecedented.
There had never been commercial airlines hijacked and used as flying missiles like that, flying bombs like that.
Not in a civilian, yeah. So, but
and the fact that it was civilian mattered.
Yes, but the controls that were added immediately, like you're saying, they weren't added only because we suddenly discovered that could happen. They were added because people were afraid, and they were able to see it. If this had happened 100 years before, nobody in England would have cared for at least a few days, maybe weeks, because they wouldn't have had access to the TV.
But we still would have had the restrictions when they caught up with it. I don't think
that's debatable.
I don't think you can assume that we'd not have those restrictions.
Here's where I'm going with it. I think that 9/11 was one of the first times where we had a global sort of panic, a global fear-based situation where...
Oh, no, we've had those multiple times in the past. Multiple times. It's ridiculous to say that was the first one. Global
instantaneous. Where you have access. You didn't have access.
We've had news wires since the 19th century.
Yes, but you didn't have access to those types of images.
How long do you think it took for images for news about the Titanic sinking to get back?
Right, but when the Titanic sank, did the whole world within 2 days suddenly institute new ship regulations, or did people stop taking cruises immediately upon that happened? No, on 9/11 you had access to those images instantly.
It took a little longer. That doesn't matter. You still had changes to shipbuilding regulations as a result.
Okay, but regardless of that.
One of the important changes that happened as a result, as a direct result of the Titanic disaster, was that, and it remains in place to this day, is that ships must now have enough lifeboats for all the passengers on board. Before Titanic, they didn't have to. Did you know
Okay.
that? That was a change made as a result of the Titanic disaster, and the change is still in place today.
Right. So the difference between that and 9/11, COVID, every other situation we're talking about right now is that now it happens the same day. If the
So it's
Titanic sank today, tomorrow every ship would have the lifeboats. Back when the Titanic, maybe it happened over a period of years, right?
no,
Where,
it was it
it's
was much
speeding
faster.
up.
The change was much faster than that.
The reason I'm even in this debate right now with you is that I wanted to loop it back to CBDC, because the idea that, and by the way, CBDC is like being used in so many different ways. The way I'm using it right now is the concept that eventually we're going to do away or minimize the role of private banks. Every citizen of the US, of the EU, whatever, is going to have an account with the central bank. Then the central bank obviously is going to be an arm of the government in controlling what's in your wallet at any given time, can add, delete, whatever. That's the big long-term fear of a lot of people. They don't want government to micromanage them through adding and subtracting money from their account. My point with this conversation is that 9/11, COVID, everything else in between, and the access to instant data, instant images, instant media, the ability to freeze everybody's, and we saw it already with COVID. I mean, with COVID, to be able to lock down an entire nation in like a week or less
Yeah,
is like
I know where you're going.
unbelievable. So with
I do know where you're
CBDC,
going.
they'll, if they could wake up one day, something happens, say, okay, nobody has access to money today, or you
Yeah,
can now spend
absolutely. Why
$3.
not? And they did that in Greece, of course.
They
We
did
know
it, but ineffectively. They couldn't do it as
they did it.
effectively as they'll
No,
be
they
able to
did
do it
it.
with digital cash.
They did it completely effectively. They shut all the banks, all of them, and all people could get out per day was a particular allowance of cash,
Right. Yeah, and
right?
if you didn't have any already, you were kind of screwed, right?
That was all you could get in
But
cash.
the difference with the CBDC is that there is no cash. You only have that account, and they can just wipe it out right there. And it's like just evaporating the money out of your wallet.
Well, yeah,
That's the fear.
yeah,
And
no,
it's
I
like
understand.
there's no reason it's not going to happen is basically the end game here. It's like
Well,
everything is
I
trending
don't
that
think
direction.
I don't think it is the end game, to be frank. I don't think we are seeing seeing the resurrection of Gosbank, but I'm not as much of a conspiracy theorist as that. But but I
I'm
do.
just a realist.
That's not realism; it's conspiracy theory. I can see the argument. I don't think that would happen to ordinary people, but I do think it is a risk for some minorities. That I don't think the government should have the power to shun, to lock people out
Right.
of a financial system so completely that they don't have the means to live. And that's, in my view, why we need private monies.
Including conservative white men, right?
Of course.
Okay,
Why would
fair.
that be? Why would I exclude them?
As long as we're treating everybody equally,
Of course I
then
am.
I'm
Why do you
happy.
think why do you think I wouldn't?
Because most people, when they make these arguments, they try to frame it in some concept of a power structure that they visualize, where they see white men at the top and not deserving of any safeguards, and actually that they deserve to be punished for the sins of their ancestors.
But that's not how I
And
see it, and that's
well,
not how I see it, and never has been.
we need you over here
I
because we're
really
getting
don't. I really don't see it that way. I don't. Conservative men should no more be shut out of things than anyone else.
fair
No,
enough.
equality has to mean equality, and if that means that some people, it can't mean that some people are discriminated against because you're cross with them
Right.
because of things that have happened in the past. That's not equality. It just isn't. So no, I don't think and for me, if no government should have the power to deny someone the means to live. I'm very disturbed by where my own government is going in this respect. They already have the power to deny some people the means to live, and I don't think they should have that power.
We're on the same page there. Well, listen, I've kept you.
I told you I'm really quite libertarian, and that might surprise people.
You are, see?
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's plenty that you and I have in common for sure. I think there's certain areas where it goes off the rails, but I think that generally there's a lot that matches up. So I'm glad that we got to talk.
Am I different from how you expected? How you thought I was?
No, that's why I'm kind of fascinated by you a lot, because you make excellent points in a very pragmatic and realistic way. I will say this though, I wish that we could get a little deeper. Maybe we can even do it again, like, on the ideas of decentralization and whether there's any. The one area where we seem to really diverge is like whether or not people should be treated like criminals, just in case they might be. And I think that's a general philosophical thing that affects all of money.
I think I've already said that in general I don't. I gave you the example of I can go to my local supermarket and yes, okay, the attendant will simply come and press a button saying she's obviously over. Well, it's actually over 25. I don't think you need to make that assumption about people, but that store attendant is doing it on the basis of what I look like, so it's a bit of an identity thing.
That's a benign example. Like,
right?
It's about money. It's about Bitcoin. It's about freedom to have money. Mm-hmm.
It's a question. There are an awful lot of kind of trade-offs in all of this. So the trade-off between freedom to do things without people having to prove who you are, or pass all these tests, or prove that you're complying with the law or something, versus the protection of people from people who don't comply with the law. And it is a trade-off. It's not simple. If you have absolute no one ever has to prove anything and it's all anonymous, then you have no protection. No one has any protection. And the problem with financial systems, and in crypto is true, is this is true in crypto as anywhere else, is you get information asymmetry. So and whereby there are people who have knowledge that they don't share with other people. The crypto world isn't transparent, yeah. And saying you can go and look on the blockchain, when you're dealing with smart contracts and stuff like that, that's not good enough. You've got to read the code. With the best one in the world, most people can't. So there are information asymmetries involved, and those people who are naive, people who are ignorant, people who don't understand this thing, people who just got into it because it was sold to them as the next best thing, and they have no basis on which to make any decision. In other words, people have been lied to. They have no way, really, in a system like this, and financial systems always end up like this one way or another, with information asymmetries, because information is power and people will hold it to themselves, and and things become jargonous very easily, so something that ought to be understood by everybody actually isn't, and then you end up having to put in place protections to protect people who just haven't got enough information, don't understand, and are easily exploited.
Yeah, and I'm with you on a lot of this stuff. I think I don't want to conflate Bitcoin with what's going on Ethereum and DeFi and that kind, because the smart contracts and that stuff goes the other way. But with Bitcoin, it is transparent. It's very clear what's happening at all times. The identity might not be associated with it, but you can see what's happening and where. The real question is, does a individual human being have a right to own value that they can use to buy food, to buy water, to buy shelter? Do they have a right to hold that value in their own possession without the permission of a government? Right? That's what it boils down to for me. And to me, the answer is yes.
And of course they do if they want to. And I don't think anybody's saying otherwise.
That the governments around the world are trying to move in a complete opposite direction of that. There's just a fact that you can't even purchase Bitcoin in America without showing an ID, and you can't legally sell it to another person without having a money transmitter's license. Like things like that are just outrageous examples of how the government is trying to stifle.
Hang on a minute, that's not true, is it? Because that's all to do with the gateway, with the gatekeepers. If you're just transacting peer-to-peer with Bitcoin, you don't have to have any license.
Yeah, but you need to bridge from the traditional system. Otherwise, we're forced to use it.
And when you are bridging to the transitional system, then you are not dealing in Bitcoin, you're dealing in dollars, and you are subject to the gatekeepers and the checks and everything else that are in the dollar system.
But we're forced to use the traditional system. If we don't use the traditional system, we go to jail.
You can transact peer-to-peer in Bitcoin without going to jail.
Yes, but you have to use the traditional system to pay your taxes. You have to use the traditional system in a number of different ways. You have to earn your money in that fiat currency.
And when you use the traditional system, then you play by the traditional system's rules.
No, yeah, but you're forced to use it, or you go to jail if you don't pay your taxes. That's what it boils down to. You can't opt out of fiat.
Or you go, well, why shouldn't you pay your taxes? You live in the country. If you don't want to pay your taxes, go and live in a different one.
Yeah, but my point is, every American and every European.
Why shouldn't you pay your taxes?
I'm not saying you shouldn't pay your taxes. I'm saying that you're forced to use fiat. That's what fiat means, right? It's force.
Yeah. So why should governments have to accept what you want to use?
Well, you're using fiat as the bridge from fiat to Bitcoin as the justification for identifying every Bitcoin holder. It's like, yeah, you can earn I could go to do a job and try to get somebody to pay me in Bitcoin.
If you are working entirely in Bitcoin, you don't have to identify yourself, but in the traditional financial system, you do. So if you're using the traditional financial system, you have to play by its rules.
Yes, but businesses and individuals are forced to use the fiat system, and it's impractical to think that Bitcoin can survive, can live just from Bitcoin would have zero value if you weren't able to bridge from the money that the world is using.
But why should a government accept Bitcoin as tax payment?
I'm not even saying that they should accept Bitcoin as a tax payment. I'm saying that they should allow people to opt out of the fiat system. I believe that.
No, because that amounts to not paying taxes.
So we're going in circles.
So if you live in a country, it's reasonable for you to pay your taxes.
Yes. We're going in circles because this whole thing started right here because my point was that the government should not have the right, and it doesn't have the right to identify the movement of every dollar that happens. And that's what the government wants. And that's what KYC AML is. It gives the government.
But it does have that right.
No, it doesn't. It does. Yeah, that's where we diverge. It has that right only because people are forced to use the fiat system. And
those are the rules of the fiat system. If you use it, you play by its rules.
Yeah, but you have to. If I don't use it, I go to jail.
You have a choice of living in another country.
Now we get into even if I live in another country, I'm forced to pay American tax, right? But that's a whole separate podcast, isn't it?
Well, that's true, actually. You are, but America's the only country, as far as I know, the only country in the world that makes people pay taxes wherever they are in the world.
Right.
So you'd have to relinquish your citizenship. We don't have to do that. If I move to a different country, I don't pay British taxes.
Yeah, I'm kind of jealous. But, well, listen, I really appreciate you doing this. We're going to have to do this again sometime.
Yeah, it's been fun.